Like a kiss from a badass angel. Really excited to have our next guest on because his book is actually a book we handed out as a handbook here at Louder with Crowder for people and new hires. It is Extreme Ownership. He's one of the co-authors of this. He also has the Jocko podcast at jockopodcast.com. You can follow him at Jocko Willink, retired Lieutenant Navy SEAL, more medals than we can mention, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, also founder of, I want to make sure I get this right, Echelon front leadership firm, consulting firm. He does so much, it's incredible. But this book is something that's really been pivotal to this team. Jocko, thank you for being on the show, sir.
Thanks for having me on.
Well, I'm very glad to have you on. You're an intimidating character, so I hope this goes well and I get on your good side. For those who haven't yet read the book...
Yet to be determined.
Yes, to be determined. And usually it doesn't bode well for me. For those who haven't yet read the book, meaning people not in the Louder with Crowder company, and I highly recommend it, can you help them understand, define what extreme ownership means?
Yeah, so extreme ownership is the attitude, it's the mindset that you're not going to blame anyone else or anything else when something goes wrong. You're actually going to take ownership of whatever that problem is, and you're going to get that problem fixed. And I know it sounds relatively simple, but it's actually pretty hard for people to do.
So why do you think it is hard for people to do? Like, what would be some prime examples of that for people, not the Navy SEAL crowd, more so the stay-at-home crowd?
Well, one of the hardest things about taking ownership when things go wrong is you have an ego and you don't want to admit that something is your fault. And what you'd rather do as a human being is just blame other people or blame the circumstances or blame the market or blame anything else.
Yeah.
And when all you do is sit around and blame other people and other things, then guess what? That problem doesn't go away. It just usually gets worse.
Right.
So that's the idea of extreme ownership. There's something going wrong. I'm going to take ownership. It's my responsibility. I'm going to get it fixed.
And even the truth is, and I think you talk about this in the book, sometimes it is somebody else's fault, but it doesn't help you because you can't control them. And you talk about ego quite a bit. And funny thing is, I actually came to know you through some interviews about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I don't know how I stumbled across you, but you were talking about sort of combat arts versus some of the, I guess, shall we say, less effective martial arts. But it was very respectful, but I could read between the lines. You talk quite a bit about ego when you discuss the combat sports side, and we've had Joe Rogan on, Daniel Cormier just last week, Tim Kennedy. They talk a lot about how ego clouds, it destroys. Can you define that a little more clearly for people who may not know when you're talking about ego and how to avoid that specifically?
Yeah, well, the problem with ego is if you've got a big ego, and I'm not talking about having no ego, because
Right.
if you have no ego, if you're Daniel Cormier, you got to think that you're going to be the champion. You got to think, you got to believe that you can make it happen. But you have to counter that with some level of humility, where you say, you know what, I'm not the best in the world. The person that I'm going to be fighting is going to be awesome, and I've got to be at my best game. So what does that mean? That means I have to train hard. That means I have to prepare. I have to do everything in my power to be ready for this fight. If people lack humility, then they say, "Oh, I don't need to train hard because I'll be able to beat this guy anyways." And then guess what? They get beat.
Yeah, it happens all the time. We had George St. Pierre on the show, and he talked about how he was terrified before every fight. And Daniel Cormier said that in his mind, he was going through excuses right before Miocic of why he should lose that fight. He's 255 pounds. I'm really a middleweight. He said that. He was very candid on the show, which is something else that I noticed with really successful people. Having been blessed enough to interview people at the top of their field, once they get there, they tend to be candid. You have the exceptions to the rule, but they tend to be transparent because I don't know that they have a lot of time not to be. Let me ask you this. How do you differentiate then? This is a tough question. We've talked about this on the program. How to differentiate between ego and a realistic assessment of your abilities, particularly if you have abilities that are greater than average?
Well, I'll tell you right now, most people that end up in a position where they're greater than average, they're not sitting around saying, "Oh, I'm the greatest in the world." They're like Daniel Cormier saying, "You know what? I could lose this fight." They're like George St. Pierre, paranoid and scared before every fight. The guys that think they're just going to win every single fight, they're the ones that end up getting caught earlier in their career. And even somebody that comes across as having a massive ego, like Conor McGregor, if you watch how Conor McGregor actually trains, he's training like he wants to be the best. He knows he's got weaknesses in his game, and he steps up to cover those weaknesses.
Yeah, there's a difference between selling fights and your lifestyle. Let me ask you this: where do you think the line is between? You kind of mentioned like George St. Pierre, fear, almost a little bit of paranoia. Where's the line, especially as someone who's in the military, and obviously you're afraid when you're going into a firefight and you could die. Where's the line between fear, paranoia, and using it so that it's productive?
So there's definitely a difference between fear and respect. And I wasn't afraid of the enemy, but I respected the enemy, and I realized that they could do some things that could surprise us and catch us off guard, and that's something you have to deal with. If you don't respect the enemy, which I guess, if you're not afraid of the enemy at all, if you just think you can dominate the enemy, well, then you start cutting corners, you don't train as hard, you don't prepare as much. When you do that, you're going to lose.
Yeah. You see that with almost every great fighter, right? The tail end of their career isn't usually their age. You look at guys like Mike Tyson, the tail end of their career is usually they get complacent. I think a lot of people miss that. They just think, oh, he got old. And you look at him like, well, actually, he was 35. He was 35 at this point. Not Mike Tyson specifically, but it happens a lot. And they just get to, you get to a point. I think it was Jeff Danaher who said, it's hard to get out of bed at 6 a.m. when you're getting out of silk sheets. I'm like, yeah, okay. That sort of crystallizes that perfectly.
And the same thing happens with businesses too. Businesses that, because we work with businesses all the time, and as the business grows and they start to feel like, oh, we're going to crush the competition can't touch us. And then the next thing you know, there's someone that's younger, some business, some company that's smaller, and they're younger and they're hungrier, and they're working their tails off. Yeah. And if you're sitting on the top of the hill, you don't think you need to work anymore. And the next thing you know, you're getting eaten.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's happened right now with late night. Great example. You've seen these late night wars, and people become so complacent, just take their audience for granted, and then all of a sudden it fractures, and we draft in right behind them. We have no business doing it, but we're doing okay. And I think that's actually a big difference between a job in the military and employees who often might read this book in the civilian workforce, is the ability to ignore something if it's not on your item list, right? You see that a lot. If it's not my job description, well, it's not my fault. Whereas in special forces in the military, if you do that, you could die. And I know you talk about primarily leading by example and taking active ownership and consequences with action. So how do you balance leading by example, what you're talking about, taking extreme ownership, being assertive with hierarchy and respecting leadership? Because they're both important.
Yeah, they're both important. And for one thing, when people talk about the military and you think, oh, well, I was in the SEAL team, so every SEAL is just going to take ownership of everything, and they're never going to say that's not my job, and that's actually wrong. And it's wrong across every group of human beings in the world. Sure. They're all human beings first and foremost, and there's people that are in the SEAL teams and special operations in the military in general. There's a bell curve, and there's some people at the high end of the bell curve that work really hard and are really gifted, and they go out and kick ass, and there's some people at the bottom end of the bell curve, and they're trying to skate by and see what they can get away with. And then there's a bunch of people in the middle in various degrees that fall out somewhere on that spectrum. So even in the military, it's not like, oh, you just do what I tell you. That's what you need to do, is just do what I tell you. They're people. And so whether you're in the military or whether you're in the civilian sector, you've got to, as a leader, you've got to recognize that you're going to have some people that are going to be going really hard, and it's great to have those people, but there's also going to be some people that you're going to have to drag along a little bit. And obviously, there's some people that you have to drag along so much that you can't drag them along anymore, and they're starting to drag you backwards. Mm-hmm. And when that happens in the civilian sector, that means you're probably going to have to get rid of them. In the military, it means you're going to have to get rid of them. This is after, of course, as a leader, you've done everything you can to try and coach them and try and mentor them and try and get them up to speed. So, leadership is leadership, regardless of where you are, whether you're in the military working with an elite group or whether you're in the civilian sector. It's leadership principles stay the same.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think that's actually a really important point. I had a friend who was in the Marines, and obviously some friends who were in the Army Rangers, and they said, yeah, it's not exactly what you think. We're not a monolith. And one of them actually told me, who was a former Navy SEAL from a long time ago, and he said back then, we didn't spend much time on hand combat. Everyone thinks I can kill you 5 ways to Sunday. He said, I learned Taekwondo with a 50-pound backpack. He's like, I didn't learn how to fight. I learned how to shoot. And I appreciated, again, that candor. I was going, oh, okay. And then afterwards, I became a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt after the military. Early on in the book, you detail a story from Iraq in which friendly fire occurred. Tough story to read about for people who end up reading the book. Highly recommend it. Again, it's called Extreme Ownership. I think it's available everywhere books are sold, and probably audiobook. I don't know if we can get Andrew Klavan to do an audiobook on that. That would be it would be soothing. It would smooth over the rough parts. But as
I did the audiobook. Myself and Leif Babin, we did the audiobook. So
I assume that you did, but the really intense parts, Andrew Klavan has a voice that's just it would make it sound soothing. Enemy fire, and you're like, oh wow, it doesn't sound half bad. So this was a friendly fire incident. And as a commander in charge, you did something that a lot of people wouldn't. You came forward and took full responsibility for the situation, which to me was very striking. Why'd you do that, Jocko?
Well, it was a tough thing. It was a tough thing to come to. It was a tough thought in my head. And as I talk about in the book, as I was trying to, this horrible situation took place. There was all kinds of people to blame, whether they were some of my guys, some of the soldiers, Marines we were working with, whether it was the Iraqi soldiers we were working with. We were all working together, and there was plenty of mistakes that were made. And it was definitely a situation where I could have pointed the finger at many different people and many different mistakes that were made. And as I went through this, because, my commanding officer, they're doing an investigation. They're trying to figure out who they're going to blame.
Right.
And as I'm sitting there trying to figure out who I'm going to blame and who I'm going to tell my boss, is this guy's fault, I couldn't figure out. I couldn't figure out who I should be blaming for this. And there's a reason why I couldn't figure out who to blame, because as I sat there and grilled over it in my mind, I realized that there was one person and one person only to blame, and that person was me. I was the commander. I'm all in charge of the mission. And if something isn't done right, that's my fault and it's my responsibility. And that's what I did. I went in before my commanding officer and before my troops and said, hey, guys, this was my fault. And here's the important part, or the other important part, is this is my fault, and this is what I'm going to do to fix it. So a lot of people, once they read the book, they say, well, if I take ownership of something, then it just disappears. And that's not true either. If you say, yeah, that was my fault, and then everyone goes, oh, okay, great, it was his fault, now we can move on. No, actually, that doesn't fix the problem.
Right.
You have to actually take ownership of the problem. Then you have to take ownership of figuring out what the solution is. Then you have to take ownership of implementing the solution so that the problem doesn't occur again. So it's not as easy as taking extreme ownership, but the first step is definitely a challenging one. And again, goes back to ego. For me, I had been in for, 15 or 16 years at the time. And, I had a good reputation as a SEAL, and I'd done a good job, and I'd been to combat. And now all of a sudden I'm saying, hey, this horrible thing happened, which, in my opinion, a fratricide, a friendly fire incident is about the worst thing you can have happen. And for me, it was a real blow to my ego to step up and say, hey, this was my fault, and I'm not going to blame anyone else. But at the same, and there's one piece of it where in a leader's mind, they think, oh, well, if I take the blame for this, everyone's going to look down on me and they're going to lose respect for me.
Right.
But the opposite is actually true. When a leader says, hey, look, here's what I did wrong, these are the mistakes I made, and this is what I'm going to do to fix it, people actually gain respect for you because they realize that you're not going to shirk your responsibilities.
And I think maybe that brings us back to a point you were talking about before, where there are some people who might need a little bit of prodding along, dragging along, and there are some people who you just can't drag necessarily anymore. So I think at that point, the people who can be developed, they'll respect you more. But like you said, the people who might just have to be let go regardless, it may fall on deaf ears. And that's a skill in leadership that you also have to be able to determine. The people whose minds you can change, the people who you can lead. And there are some people who can't. For example, we went out and people have tried to bomb our van because of our opinions. We're like, well, hold on. We can change this lady's opinion. The transgender who works at Juiceland wanted to slash my tires. Maybe let that sit for a little bit. Let me ask you this. Do you think, too, that obviously doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and combat sports, and that's very different from traditional martial arts where it's kata and not full contact, I've definitely learned in my life, it breaks down ego because you just get your ass kicked so constantly. I tell everyone it's good for a man to get his ass kicked at least once. And it sounds like false machismo, but I mean it. Do you think that's played a big part in your humility?
It absolutely has. And that's one of the things about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu for sure, because you can be a 225-pound guy and roll in there to a Jiu-Jitsu academy. And if you don't know any Jiu-Jitsu, literally a woman or a 130-pound or 135-pound woman will choke you out, and there's nothing you can do about it. And so it is an absolutely extremely humbling sport to be involved with, and it's the same thing with boxing, it's the same thing with wrestling, it's the same thing with Muay Thai. If you don't know what you're doing and you step into the ring or the cage or onto the mat, you're going to experience massive humility because there's nothing you can do about it. And it definitely helped me. It made me respect other people as well, because you don't know who you're dealing with in the street, right? Yeah. You don't know who that person is. And you might be running your mouth to someone that can actually crush you in a fist fight.
Yeah.
And so I think it's great for people to do. And a lot of times, I've written a couple kids' books too. And I obviously in the kids' books, I encourage the kids to work out, be strong, and know how to fight.
Yeah.
And
I don't think it's as popular as the fold-out TikTok went the clock. It may not be the first book kids reach for at bedtime.
Yeah, well, the funny thing is I was on an interview with NPR, but yeah, exactly. And the funny thing was they were saying, well, there was a lot of people that the guy was really honest with me, and he said, there was a lot of people that were concerned about having you on this program and having you talking about turning kids into warrior kids. That's the name of the series. The book series is The Warrior Kid. A lot of people were concerned about turning people into warrior kids and teaching them about fighting and being stronger. And what people don't realize is that when a kid is strong, when a kid is confident, when a kid knows how to fight, they're much, much less apt to actually get into a fight or to get into trouble in general.
Right.
So, it's
at the
really,
very least, they believe, this is one thing, actually, my good friend Henry Gracie, he teaches a bully proof, and he was on the show to talk about it. And he said, listen, you can't solve the problem with young boys you can't solve the self-esteem problem without them knowing that they're not going to get their ass kicked. He says, they don't have to be the best fighter, they don't have to be the toughest kid, but almost all of the solutions right here from principle is you tell them, you stop this right now. You walk up in that bully's face and you say, you better stop it, or else what? If the kid knows he's going to get his ass kicked, it has no teeth, like a parent who makes it to 3 and doesn't do anything and the kid runs roughshod over them. People don't, that is an important point. Knowing that you can handle yourself changes the way that you carry yourself. I'm surprised NPR didn't like you coming in. I wonder if when you walked in was a jawline and a cleft and they said, we have a problem. He's different from most of us.
I will give respect to him because they brought me on. It was a really fair interview. The guy had a good conversation with me. I was happy to expose that to a new group of people and to the theories that I believe in, and the interview went well and it got a lot of listens. So I'm fine with it.
On a serious note, did you develop the cleft and the jawline from years of badassery, or did you just come out of the womb with this?
Oh, I got issued that once I joined the SEAL team.
Just gave you a buzz cut, like a kiss from a badass angel. Let me ask you this. So extreme ownership is obviously a concept that anyone can apply, and you talk about that in the book. But I do wonder this, and our mutual friend, Tim Kennedy, he was talking about this on Joe Rogan's podcast, where he said it's harder to get into the military today than in college. That a lot of people just think it's take anyone and it's their last effort. He said that's actually not the case. He got a lot of blowback. And he was effectively saying that the military tests for a lifestyle versus test scores. In other words, he was saying you can't, I think his actual words were, you can't get off the couch eating Cheetos and smoking pot and expect to get into the military, but you can in college as long as you do well in the tests in that subject. So let me ask you this. Considering right now that there are kind of two camps, the camps of professors and feminists teaching this idea of toxic masculinity in which any kind of assertive leadership qualities are vilified. And then in contrast with the equally kind of subversive faux alpha male pickup culture, do you think that more young men specifically aren't being raised today in a culture of extreme ownership, that it's a problem at this moment in time more than before?
Well, I'd say it not only applies to young men, I'd say it applies to young women and younger people in general. And that being said, I have to say, I still do work with the military, and the young kids that are coming in the military right now, the young millennials who have a really horrible rap, they're awesome guys, and they're going to go crush it overseas, and they're going to take the fight to our nation's enemies. And so there's definitely a large group of people that are being raised right and going to defend the country. And at the same time, there's definitely. I mean, is there any question about what you just asked me, really?
I don't know. I was going to say, it almost sounded like you disagree with me for a second, and I was going to have to say, well, hold on a second there, Jocko. Those are the guys who've made the cut, who you're seeing. I mean, they thinned the herd quite a bit before they get to you. They don't put you before in the first round audition. You're kind of a callback.
Yeah. No, but I think you can look around at what's happening with sort of, you can look at Jordan Peterson, you can look at your show, you can look at, like, my podcast.
Yeah.
The people are listening to it. People are buying extreme ownership. People are buying my kids' books. That's what's happening. My other book, Discipline Equals Freedom, Field Manual. It's about, like, getting after it. That's what it's about. It's about taking ownership of your life. It's about working out. It's about learning how to shoot. It's about learning martial arts. It's about working out early in the morning. It's about being disciplined. That's what it's about. And that book sold awesome. Yeah. And so I think while we're seeing, the one side, the people that are saying, it's everyone else's fault, which is basically the people that you're talking about. Yeah. Hey, I didn't get where I wanted to be in life because of these following reasons, but it wasn't my fault. And there's a number of us in the world that are saying, actually, well, it is your fault. And when someone says to themselves, okay, did I not get into college because they didn't like me because I was X, Y, or Z? Or did I not get in college because I didn't work hard enough and get good enough grades, and that's why I didn't get in? Right. Or if I didn't get in the military, did I not get in the military because they don't like me or they don't like where I come from? Or did I not get in the military because I'm morbidly obese and I smoke pot every day? Like, that's going to be a problem. So,
but it is also beautiful according to the billboards. I will say this, that what you talk about a lot, discipline equals freedom. You know, as someone I've struggled a lot with ADHD my whole life. And I mean this as a kid, they thought I was learning disabled for a period of time. I had to learn in French Canadian. It's a whole different story, but I was also very dumb. But I also didn't know I didn't do well in a class. I couldn't pay attention. You know, I couldn't sit still. And I did later on in my life. I wasn't as productive in writing comedy, in doing as much stand-up or accomplishing what I wanted to. And when I structured my day so much, you know, got up early, gym this time, lunch this time, and I would put in windows where I could free flow, all of a sudden, because of the safety that I'd created with this box of discipline, I felt more like, picture it like Pong is how I describe to people. Boop, boop, I'm free to bounce around in here because I have 2 lines. Otherwise, I'm just going to bounce off the screen and never come back. And I think a lot of creative types resist what you're talking about because they think they'll lose their creative edge, when in fact, it's the opposite.
Yeah, it's the complete opposite. The example I always use with that is Jimmy Page from Led Zeppelin. And Jimmy Page, you know, before he was in Led Zeppelin doing what he does with a guitar, which, as you know, is completely insane, he was a studio musician that was playing the notes that were dictated to him, really complex, and he did that for years.
Yeah.
And so if you want to have the freedom to rock out Led Zeppelin style, then you need to have the discipline to practice for thousands and thousands and thousands of hours to get to that level. And it's the same thing with it's a creative world, it's the same. In a regular business structure, it's the same. In a team, it's the same. And in your individual life, it's the same. The discipline that you have in all those categories will give you freedom in the end.
And you know what, actually, a good story for you for when you're doing these business seminars. I don't know if you've ever read Alice Cooper's biography, but you know, Alice Cooper was an addict and was obviously a crazy person and changed his life. He's a scratch golfer now. He's actually like the best golfer on the Pro-Am Tour. But he actually, before every single show, he lists his routine. And he said, I realized that I was kind of rushing, just rushing along the day and then going out and going on stage, and I wasn't giving my best performance. And so what he does is he goes into his green room. He takes a 30 or 40, he outlines it in his book, a 30 or 45-minute nap where he said, I shut off the lights. It doesn't matter if I sleep. I shut off the lights. No one is in there. I get up. I have 1 chocolate chip cookie. I don't know why. And I watch kung fu movies while I put on the Alice Cooper makeup, and then I get into character. It's like, and they do this routine every single show. It may sound odd to us, but that's extreme discipline for Alice Cooper. I mean, when you think about what he used to do, and he's doing as well as ever. Okay, speaking of which, what would your top 3 examples be, do you think, of extreme ownership men throughout history, or a couple that come to mind?
You know, I mean, George Washington's right up there. You know, he could have walked away at any time and said, look, we're going to get up against a military that's too strong and too organized and too well funded for us, and we're just going to give up. Abraham Lincoln, same way. You know, I mean, there's plenty of times for him to say, okay, you know what, we're this is too much. And, you know, he fired all kinds of generals and kept driving forward to make things happen. You know, my favorite military leader is actually a guy named Colonel David Hackworth, who was he was in the Korean War, he was in Vietnam. He wrote an incredible book called About Face, and he was one of those guys. He's a very controversial figure because towards the end of the Vietnam War, he got interviewed, and he was one of the most decorated soldiers at the time in the Army, and he went on an interview and he said, the way we're fighting this war, we're not going to win it. And the Army, you know, they pushed him out of the military in a matter of weeks, and he was blacklisted for many years. But as we look back at the Vietnam War, we see that he was right. And he was one of the few guys that had the intestinal fortitude to stand up and say, look, the way we're doing this is wrong. And so I think that person that stands up, takes ownership of the situation, regardless of what it's going to mean for their personal outcome, is a good leader to me.
You know what, George Washington immediately comes to mind. And I know people say, oh, that's so cliche. And I go, well, hold on a second. A country that left the world's greatest superpower ever, the British Empire, to become the world's greatest superpower ever. That's never happened before or since. 1 century that occurred. And George Washington, I think important to add to what you just said, you know, could have walked away at any time when was facing a very powerful military. And it's also just as important, he walked away when he had all the power and people didn't want him to walk away. Talk about ego. That's a guy who said, this is consistency with my position and what I believe this office to be. That is why George Washington is right up there with me. And then on a personal level, Teddy Roosevelt. I'm not a huge fan of him necessarily politically, but if you look at his life, the strenuous life and how sickly he was as a kid, I think is a good example. Okay, final question for you, and then I know we do have to get going again. It's extreme ownership. People, you can buy it wherever you buy books. I don't even need to say. People say, hey, Amazon, Barnes, wherever you buy books, buy the book. My grandfather was an Air Force fighter pilot. Career was a colonel, high-level military service, and transitioned to the civilian sector, and it was kind of a challenge for him. And I know you work with a lot of people like this. How are you able to navigate from an environment with the most serious of stakes, life or death, or help people like my grandfather, to then the business world or the entertainment industry as you're doing? How do you make that transition? Because I know it's got to be a hard one sometimes, and a bit of a kind of leveling off and figuring out the levels of intensity. It's not everyone who can do it. Yeah,
well, being in the business world, being in the military in the first place, yes, it's very intense. You have a great mission, and you're very driven to accomplish that mission. The stakes are very high. And in the business world, I tell people all the time, because people ask me the same question, how can we come at it with the same kind of intensity? And when I tell people in the business world, especially business leaders, is, look, in the military, we're dealing with lives, but in the civilian sector, you're dealing with livelihoods. And you as a leader of a company, if I don't do the right thing and make the right moves, and I don't stay humble and make things happen and get aggressive when I need to get aggressive and back off when I need to back off, well, I've got 20, 200, 2,000 employees that are counting on me to make the right decisions so they can feed their families. Right. And that is a heavy burden. And, it might not be the exact same burden that you get as a leader in the military, where the actual lives of your men are at stake. But in the civilian sector, what is life? What is life? Life is, hey, I'm going to take care of my family. I'm going to feed them. I'm going to give them a roof over their head. That's what I'm doing as a human. That's my goal. If you take that away from me, you've kind of taken away my life. You've taken away my livelihood, and that's problematic. So there's pressure on both sides, and that's why being a leader is a hard thing to do. There's a heavy burden of command in both situations. As opposed to, give a roof over their head, as opposed to Bill Cosby, who would answer that, give a roofie over their head. That's a problem. So we don't want to be like him either. Not an extreme ownership guy, Bill Cosby. No. But no, I think that's important to know. And you know what? Running a business myself and employing I don't know, a dozen to 15 people. And my wife's father, my father-in-law, employs about 50 people. It really does change things. It's like a family. And they have to look out for people who they provide for. Effectively, these people rely on them to make a living, and they're not looking to harm those people. And they've had to make some pretty tough calls. People who they really like. My father-in-law had to make, I remember, some decisions that were really, really just torturous for him. Okay, this book is Extreme Ownership. The author is, let me get your Twitter correct here. It's Jocko Willink, 2 L's, L-L-I-N-K. The podcast is jockopodcast.com. Jocko, I know that you're going to get a lot of young men who are going to read this and are going to be inspired. And you're going to get a lot of young women who are simply going to want to get a phone call back from you. So, be ready for that. They can run that through my wife and 4 kids. I think that they'll probably try and find you directly. Our female fans are very aggressive. We've turned the tables on Al Gore and used the internet to our advantage. If you like this video, subscribe by hitting the subscribe button or the notification bell next to it, because subscribing isn't enough. Watch one of these other videos. And, listen, you can stick around. You don't have to.